Welcome back to the second in our Growing Disciples series of 5 Psalms taken from the worshipping life of Israel. Our previous devotional in Psalm 53 was a maskil, a song intended to teach wisdom as it was regularly sung as part of the liturgical life of the temple in Jerusalem. This devotional from Psalm 54 is similarly set for our instruction, even though the theme is quite different. Psalm 54 is all about betrayal, about being betrayed by someone you thought you could trust. And we all need wisdom when faced with such a situation, and David provides our example, our model, in Psalm 54. Ultimately, however, this is a psalm that prepares us for Jesus Christ, and in doing so, perhaps we have an insight into his own personal experience of the cross. Psalm 54 begins with this superscript: "For the director of music, with stringed instruments, a maskil of David." So it's a very similar superscript to Psalm 53 at its beginning, identifying this as another maskil, a wisdom psalm. But this time we have more detail of the life situation in which it is set. When the Ziphites had gone to Saul and said, "Is not David hiding among us?" In 1 Samuel 23, we hear the story of David's betrayal by the people of Ziph. David was on the run from King Saul, who planned to kill him just as soon as he could track him down. And David and his men were living the furtive nomadic life of the outlaw, hiding out in the desert of Ziph. Now, Ziph was just 20 kilometres from Bethlehem, the hometown of David's family. Being in familiar country, not far from his hometown, David, the former shepherd, held a tactical advantage over Saul and his men. Now, doubtless David expected other advantages while hiding out in this area. Particularly, he might expect that the people of Ziph would extend some kind of loyalty to him and his men, at least by staying quiet and not dobbing him into King Saul. But instead, the Ziphites betrayed David. So 1 Samuel 23 verse 19, "The Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah and said, 'Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh, on the hill of Hachilah, south of Jeshimon?'" So lots of detail there. It's a precise location. "Now, your majesty, come down whenever it pleases you to do so, and we will be responsible for giving him into your hands." So David hears that he's been betrayed, and he writes Psalm 54 as an expression of his grief and as a plea for vindication. Obviously, David was protected by God, and over time this song became part of the worship of the people at the temple in Jerusalem. It was sung as worship, but also as a means of instruction for the gaining of wisdom. And we might say then that here is wisdom for when we're betrayed or ripped off or treated unfairly or unjustly. So first of all, David pleads for God's salvation. "Save me, O God, by your name. Vindicate me by your might. Hear my prayer, O God. Listen to the words of my mouth." So in the face of betrayal, David entrusts himself to God for deliverance. This is the underlying instruction of the psalm. David does not take revenge in his own strength. Whatever feelings he might have had in that moment of betrayal, he turns to God. There is a restraint here. Emotions are channeled into this prayer, into this plea. Instead of an explosion of uncontrolled anger and rage, David pleads with God for both salvation and vindication. Now, salvation usually has two dimensions or two levels in the Old Testament. First, there's a physical saving from death. Don't let me be killed by Saul, even though I've been betrayed by the Ziphites. The second idea of a spiritual salvation from eternal death beyond the grave is also present, but here it's much more in the background. But the two should not be thought of as separate and disconnected. In the Psalms, to be saved now would be a reflection of an eternal salvation to come. Vindication for David would have meant that he was demonstrated ultimately to be God's anointed king. He was proven to be in the right and with God and within Israel, and especially in his dealings with Saul. Being saved and preserved in a situation of grave danger will demonstrate God's approval and his vindication of David. But right now, David's prayer is urgent. There's an immediate problem. Verse 3, arrogant foes are attacking me. Ruthless people are trying to kill me, people without regard for God. Surely God is my help. The Lord is the one who sustains me. What happens? Well, God does indeed deliver David, as is expressed by the conclusion of the psalm. We could read all of the details of God's protection and vindication of David in 1 Samuel 23. He and his men kept on moving from place to place, hiding in caves, keeping a low profile. The Ziphites kept informing Saul of David's movements, like all spies and informants do, until eventually, toward the conclusion of that chapter, we read, as Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul saying, "Come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land." Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. So God did save David. It wasn't a decisive victory, but the very unlikely nature of the deliverance surely displays the hand of God. And so David, having entrusted himself to God, responds with thankfulness and praise in verse 6. I will sacrifice a free will offering to you. I will praise your name, Lord, for it is good. You have delivered me from all my troubles, and my eyes have looked in triumph on my foes. So, this song of instruction teaches the worshippers how to respond to betrayal. And that's great. But there's something more going on here. Now, David's experience of deliverance from the hand of his betrayer also shapes the faithful Jews' expectations of the greater David to come. The son of David would similarly be betrayed and entrust himself to God alone for his deliverance. This was no doubt a source of real grief for Jesus as he was betrayed. His betrayal was foreshadowed by David's experience, and Judas's treachery and infidelity must have hurt him deeply. But as the night of the Last Supper wore on, to varying degrees, Jesus would soon experience the abandonment of all his disciples. His closest three couldn't even keep watch with him as he prayed. The bravest of all would crumble under the cross-examination of a servant girl, denying 3 times that he even knew Jesus. So Jesus knew abandonment, betrayal, and injustice. He experienced this from the human race and from those he loved most. But he did not lash out in anger. Instead, he submitted his way to God, his Father. He trusted him for salvation and vindication. God the Father showed him to be in the right, justified, truly God's Messiah, exactly as he claimed to be. And the pattern established by David in the face of betrayal, well, that pattern was more than fulfilled by Jesus Christ and his experience and response to betrayal. Rather than taking matters into his own hands, he entrusted himself to the Father, with the result that he was obedient all the way to the cross, into death, through death, to his resurrection and glorification. So, what will you do when you feel betrayed? Is this something that's already happened to you? Maybe you'll be working on your response to that, or perhaps not. The beauty of psalms such as Psalm 54 being included in the regular liturgies of the temple was that already the worshipper is learning wisdom from praying this prayer even before we need to put it into practice.